Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. In case you're wondering what's up with the music, my new computer will not communicate with my old apps. I bought an updated version of my recording software only to discover the file was making the recordings too large to transfer to some of the podcast hosting sites. So I had to reduce the quality of the show in order to get an hour recording to transfer. Modern problems. Uh, the air conditioning is on, my electricity works, my house is paid for, my truck is paid for. I don't really have any real problems, so I have to come up with these minuscule little things to drive myself nuts. While I wait to see if I can find another soundboard that will actually communicate with the show, with the recordings, and that doesn't cost an arm and a leg, I'll just record without the music in the video. However, it will still be at the beginning of the audio recording. Don't forget, the show is being brought to you by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson. If you're not in Laredo, you can always order coffee at organicmancoffeetrike.shop. I still wonder what some of my listeners look like. It's one of those things whenever I get a comment from people and I read it, I wonder, what does this person look like? I don't know why. It's just one of those things. Uh, I have folks in just about every country in South America now. There's Ghana, they're still listening. Gabon, I think that's how it's pronounced, they've started to tune in as well. All the usual countries, Australia, Canada, Great Britain, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Germany, Romania, all those folks, they're still listening. If you could just send me a photo so I know what the world you look like. Otherwise, I have to create images in my mind, and they all look like mannequins, which is kind of disturbing. You don't even have to send a picture of yourself. Just click a photo out the window of your house. I don't know, just see what your country looks like. Something to do if you think about it. Even if you don't, I'll still be doing the show. There have been a few weird encounters with creatures that people wish they'd never seen. Here are a few things to keep in the back of your mind the next time you go looking around in places that you don't usually visit, or maybe even some of the places that you do. In one of the state parks in Montana, a park ranger was out doing his job when he found an old cabin out in the woods. The cabin was not near any roads or trails. It sat back in the thick woods, really nowhere to get there if you didn't force your way through the brush. Nobody would have found it if he hadn't been out doing his job and just stumbled across it. The cabin looked abandoned. Maybe it had been built back before the state had taken over the land. The park official knew about anyone living in the area, and he didn't recall anybody saying anything about this particular location. Next to the cabin, there was a storage shed that appeared to be quite well built. It even had a steel door on it. The door looked as if somebody had forced it open, and it was all bent and hanging from one hinge. Even though it was an abandoned building, it was still a part of the park, so therefore it was park property. The ranger went to look to see if he could figure out who had broken down the door and why. He was looking inside. There was nothing really in there. It was just an empty building. But he noticed that all the damage to the door was on the inside. It looked as if someone or something had forced its way out. He could find no answers as to what might have done this, what was trapped in the storage building. He walked over to the cabin and he looked in through one of the windows. He noticed the furniture was all scattered about the room, and it looked like something big had torn the bed apart. Sheets, blankets, and parts of the mattress lay everywhere. Movement caught his eye. A man dressed very much like an Indian, uh, Feather, not Dot, had stepped out from the woods near the shed. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he looked like he could use a bath or two. As the man walked, he didn't appear to be paying any attention to anything around him. It was like he was in a daze or a trance. As the old Indian was getting closer, he suddenly looked like he came to. He shook a bit, and then he looked around to see where he was, and that's when he spotted the ranger. The old guy turned and took off running back the way he had come. The park ranger was more curious than ever, so he tried to run after the man, yelling to get him to stop. He yelled that the old guy wasn't in any trouble. He just wanted some answers about the cabin and the shed. Like that scene in To Live and Die in L.A. Why are you running? Because you're chasing me. Why are you chasing me? Because you're running. Still not knowing what had happened, if anything had happened, the ranger went on about his job. He did plan to come back the next day and look around a bit more. The ranger did make it back to the mystery cabin, and he was approaching. He saw the same old Indian was sitting on the porch. Trying not to startle the man, the ranger called out a greeting. Hearing the voice, the old guy leaped to his feet, ran inside, and slammed the door. The ranger stepped up onto the porch and he knocked and he announced to the old guy that he wasn't in any trouble. He just wanted to ask him some questions. He tried the door only to find it was locked. The ranger carefully peeked in through one of the windows. The furniture was mostly back in its place. The chairs were back around the table, and the bed had kind of been straightened out, but the room was completely devoid of any people. As he stood there, the ranger heard a commotion coming from the back of the cabin. A bear came running from the trees at the back of the building, and it went running right past him. The ranger could see there was no back door inside the cabin. There weren't even any windows back there. Somehow the old guy had gotten from inside the cabin to gone. Was he the bear, or did he startle the bear, or what did the bear have to do with anything? The ranger had more questions than answers, and he really didn't want to get into the subject of how weird things could get, so he pretty much kept the whole thing to himself for some time. I also no longer have my cough button, so hopefully I won't be coughing into the mic anytime. Here's another weird encounter that also took place, only this time it was a national park. The National Park Service employs a lot of people who have a variety of different jobs. During what is known as fire season, a lot of these people come together to put out wildfires and try to save the park. They're easy to recognize since they wear bright yellow flame retardant shirts. One of the many things hanging from their belt is a fire shelter, better known as a shake and bake. If you have to use it, you lay on the ground with the cover over your body. As the fire gets close, the temperature goes way up and it makes it hot inside, so you're being baked. Being as close to death as a person should ever get, the firefighters tend to shake a lot. Thus the name, Shake and Bake. I've known several firefighters who worked in the parks, and they had some wild stories, but none of them wanted to share it on the podcast. During a wildfire, a supervisor went ahead to scout out the woods and see which trail would be best to deploy his crew. He was using an ATV to drive along a fire break. It's a sort of a straight line where all the trees and the brush is removed in order to try to slow down or stop any fire that starts in one part of the park. They're not very decorative. When you see them, they kind of detract from the natural look of the woods, but they're very necessary when there is a fire. As he motored along, he spotted a bobcat crouching in the middle of the trail. It just sat there, not moving, even as the firefighter got closer. The man was even able to look into the animal's eyes, and it just stared back. As if suddenly realizing there was a human and he was way too close, the bobcat let out a terrifying howl, turned, jumped up onto the trunk of a tree, and scampered up into the limbs, disappearing behind the pine needles. The firefighter thought that was just too weird, but he continued on his way, checking the woods for any fire. As the s- the s- as he scanned the trees, the firefighter saw an old cabin back in the woods on the side of the fire break, but there was no trail, no road leading to it. This was a national park, and as far as he knew, nobody was supposed to live out here in this area. The firefighter walked over to the cabin and he knocked to see if there's anybody in there. There is a fire coming. You might want to evacuate. The windows had all been boarded up, the zombie apocalypse kind of thing. The only way to look in was through the small hole that the chain ran through. He got down, he looked inside. The place was a mess. It looked as if whoever lived there was not into housekeeping. There's nothing to be learned standing there, so the firefighter went on about his mission. After scouting the fire break, he turned back towards camp. He was approaching the spot where he'd seen the bobcat, and the firefighter saw an Indian woman standing in the exact same spot where the bobcat had been. She was staring off into the distance. It reminded him of the way the bobcat had acted. The firefighter called out to the woman to see if she needed any help. Startled, the woman spun around, looked at him, and let out with an ear shattering howl. It was the same sound the cat had made. The woman ran to the same tree, jumped up into the limbs, and disappeared up into the branches. Now, this was way too weird. So the firefighter, when he got back to camp, he told his fellow crewmen what he had encountered. One of his crew was an Indian who grew up near the park. This fellow firefighter told the witness it sounded like he'd encountered a pumawa, a similar being to a skinwalker. Different tribe, different name. The Indians said that they can take on the appearance and the abilities of animals. With the number of people who go missing in state parks and national parks each year, it makes me wonder if maybe one of these creatures might have something to do with it. Mustache hair tickles the end of my nose, and, well, in 2008, near Kensington, Pennsylvania, a bunch of teens were out wandering around looking for things to do. When teenagers don't have things to do, sometimes they get in trouble, which is a bad thing. Laredo has very little for teenagers to do, so we have them getting in trouble once in a while. As they're wandering about, they spotted something poking its head up from a storm drain. The kids stood back and they watched as a large reptile looking creature came up through the manhole. It was about 4 feet tall, covered with scales, and it had a long tail. The kids decided to chase the thing. I'll bet there was beer or some other substances involved. Sober, rational people don't go chasing after well, except for, of course, the Steve Irwin and some of those guys, but well, Most folks won't go chasing after a large reptile, but these kids did. One of the teens even managed to grab it by the tail. I wonder if he said, "Crikey, he's grumpy." The creature wasn't too keen on this and it pulled away. It managed to drop out of sight into another manhole. None of the gang was brave enough to pursue the thing, especially into the dark underground. Their story got out eventually, and it was written up in several cryptid sites. Some folks say what they saw was a reptilian, a group of aliens from some distant star system. I've heard descriptions of these beings. I've talked about them on the show. Some are humanoid without tails, while others look more like dinosaurs or alligator people. A woman was out walking her dog in Anaheim, California, 2008. As she walked, she saw some kind of a green creature looking at her from a storm drain. Funny, it's the same year. As she walked, this creature was watching her walking her dog, and it didn't look too pleasant. She decided to go back the other way, but as she pulled her dog back in the opposite direction, the creature came up out of the storm drain, and it began to follow her and the dog. She felt uneasy about seeing this thing because it looked kind of hungry, and she was afraid that either her or her dog might be on the menu. Thinking bad things were coming her way, she began to run down the street until she came to a pickup parked at the curb. She was out of breath and she was not into running, and so she had gone as far as she could, and not wanting to be consumed, she clomb over the side of the pickup into the bed. The creature was still coming her way, so she got out her cell phone and she called her boyfriend. They lived in an apartment nearby, and she was hoping he could come to the rescue. As she was telling him about what she had seen, more creatures like the one that had followed her came from the same storm drain and started in her direction. Now, in a panic, she begged her boyfriend to come to the rescue, and quick. The creatures surrounded the pickup and they were trying to reach up the sides. This made her scream, which got her boyfriend to come running a lot faster. He came flying down the street armed with a golf club. Since they lived in California, where the gun laws are ridiculous, he took the only weapon he had. If this had been Texas, there would have been guns, lots of guns involved. The pickup would have probably suffered along with the reptilian creatures. Personally, I would have to decide which weaponry I needed. Number of rounds in the magazine as opposed to size of the rounds coming out of the barrel. Shotgun, rifle, pistol. I'd probably spend several minutes trying to make up my mind. But he came running armed with a golf club. He waded into the mass, swinging wildly and yelling. It sounded like he was having a good time, or he was trying to bolster his courage so that he didn't look too scared in front of his girlfriend. One or the other. Believe it or not, yelling in a situation like this sometimes does help. I guess it drowns out the sound of your own fear. One or two pairs of underwear were going to be needed changing soon, but the creatures all fled. There was no blood and no bodies around to investigate. The reptiles all escaped back to their underground lair, and both witnesses agreed there were large looking monsters with mouths full of teeth, like alligators, only on two legs. They quickly made their way back to their apartment. Neither of them wanted to call the police, not knowing what to say, and they were pretty much positive that the authorities wouldn't believe them. Their sanity would be questioned, and the possibility of a very long night answering questions was not that welcomed of an idea. The following night, they heard sounds of struggles and screams of some animal being attacked. In the morning, there were the remains of something dead on the ground near one of the storm drains. It was unidentifiable, probably some kind of animal. This was just too much for the couple, and they packed their things and they moved to another city. The Los Angeles Times from back 1930s ran a series of articles about G. Warren Suffelt, who had a map showing underground cities in the area. He believed that these had been reptilians living under the city, and they had amassed a huge stockpile of gold, silver, and precious gems. Shuffelt was convinced, and so were the city council. There was a vast amount of riches to be had by tunneling down under the city. Shuffelt brought in a construction crew and they began to dig. The city council shut him down after several months of work. They didn't say why, they just said, "You're no longer allowed to work here," and him and his crew were sent elsewhere. Surprisingly, a short while later, several oil drilling companies were brought in, and every one of them set up right over sites that Shuffelt had said there was gold, silver, or gems to be found. Of course, no report ever came out of any treasure having been found, but when is the last time government officials actually told us the truth about what was going on? Somebody probably got quite rich and kept it to themselves. The Toronto Sunday Sun came out with an article in 1979. It was titled Tunnel Monsters of Cabbagetown. Cabbagetown is a neighborhood in central Toronto, Ontario, Canada. It is defined as a part of Cabbagetown South St. Jamestown neighborhood. It is it is a group of semi-detached Victorian houses, and it is said to be the largest continuous area of preserved Victorian houses in all of North America. An old style neighborhood that is kept up. The article said that one of the residents of the district, named Ernest, not the Ernest P. Worrell, know what I mean, Vern? Not that guy. His name was just Ernest, was searching for one of his cats that had gone missing, and he found a tunnel near his apartment building. He crawled into the tunnel for about 10 feet when he encountered some kind of a bizarre creature. He was having to use a flashlight, and as it was bouncing around in the dark, he spotted this monster. It looked like a monkey with bright red, orange, glowing eyes. Well, monkeys do have eye shine, and they do come out as reddish orange. It is bizarre to run into a monkey in Canada. Not impossible, but you just don't see them every day. This creature was long and thin, and it was shaped a lot like any monkey Ernest had ever seen. Its hair was slate gray, and the creature looked to weigh about 30 pounds. Still, it just sounds like a monkey. Until it spoke to him. The creature told him to go no further. He was told that it would be best if he were to leave. Ernest fled back the way he'd come. Talking monkeys, that's right up there with flying monkeys. Once he'd escaped, he swore he was not going to tell anyone because the ridicule that he knew that would come his way. Still, eventually he did say something to someone, and the story soon got out. Reporters flocked to the area, trying to interview him and anyone else who may have seen or communicated with this creature. I can see it now. Ernest Saves Canada. If you don't want to know what I'm talking about, I'm referring to Jim Varney, who made a bunch of movies, TV shows, and a few commercials. And his catchphrase was, know what I mean, Vern? If you like that kind of movie, you'll enjoy any of his movies, and if you're not into that kind of movie, you'll just say that's kind of dumb. But he was entertaining, not like most of the movies coming out today. The people at Animal Planet's Freaky Encounters featured a segment on Toronto's tunnel monster. In the show, the city of Toronto sends a bunch of sewer workers down to inspect the tunnel system. The director of the Occult Research Bureau, who was interviewed on the show, said that the tunnel looked like it had been partially collapsed, possibly by the creature itself. The sewer workers were being sent into possibly a dangerous situation, but they all managed to come back on the show. You ever noticed any of these shows that whenever they go looking into dangerous places, they survive always? It would be a totally different program, and boy, would it boost the ratings if their host or maybe the camera crew just disappeared. Could you imagine? No, that's not going to happen because if that did happen, well, we'd never get to see the show. But it would still be a heck of a lot more interesting. What kind of a creature looks like a monkey but can speak? One idea is the Memagwesi. These are creatures from Indian lore that lived in or near rivers and lakes. They're known to be mischievous pranksters and thieves. They'll slip into the tribe at night and steal their possessions. They are known to tip over people's canoes as well. You're supposed to give them an offering, like a pinch of tobacco or like if you caught a bunch of fish, you give them one. You're supposed to give them something and then they'll leave you alone. Legend says they are also tend to steal your catch completely, even if you do offer them one. They can also be helpful on occasion. According to the stories, they live inside hollowed out rocks. They stand about 3 feet tall, covered with hair, and they have a high pitched nasal voice. Toronto is home to a large number of rivers, many of which have been buried into tunnels in order to help the city expand. As city planners knew that they couldn't simply fill in the river, the water would accumulate and it would eventually hollow out underneath the city and cause a collapse. So they created tunnels for the water to flow through. Some of these tunnels were quite large and nobody bothered to make a map of where all of these tunnels were. To prevent the city from collapsing, all of these tunnels were built leaving the city's foundations undisturbed. There are nature hikes today dedicated to these rivers called the Lost River Walks. The idea the Memangwesi moved from the hollowed out rocks into these tunnels under the cities comes to a lot of folks' minds. Perhaps there's an entire community of these creatures living under Toronto, eating whatever comes their way. I like my cats walking around and not on the menu. Speaking of my cats, I managed to get them all out of the studio before recording. They're at the door right now, banging on it and demanding entry back in. I know some homeless folks. The politically correct term is unhoused. I am not politically correct. Homeless folks who will move into just about any unoccupied place in order to set up camp. How about we call them urban outdoorsmen? All right, they're not all men. There are a lot of women out there too. A placeless person. Nah, we'll call them homeless. It's a lot better than calling them bums like what we used to call them. Anyway, lots of these folks go missing each year. Some just might have slipped into a tunnel thinking they'd found a place to sleep, only to find the monkey creatures. Speaking of politically correct nonsense, people are being told to stop using the word mummy when referring to those dead folks on display in museums. Instead, the correct term is a mummified dead person. Someone just might be offended if you call them mummies. Who? The dead guy? Uh, Maybe that's not such a bad idea, come to think of it. No, no, this is just plain crazy. But yes, there are people out there saying, don't call them mummies. That's an offensive term. Call them mummified dead people. I want to know who these people are that keep coming up with these stupid ideas and they get paid for it. I'll be willing to bet some of them wear white lab coats. Just a thought. Anyway, this also brings to mind, at what time in life does grave robbing become archaeology? How old does the grave have to be before you're not going to get arrested and thrown in jail for being a resurrectionist? Just a thought. I'm also upset by those clowns who decided that Pluto wasn't a planet. They didn't ask me, and I'll bet they didn't ask you either. This is our solar system, and we should be able to call things what we want to, as opposed to somebody in a white lab coat telling us what we can and can't call them. Pluto is a planet. It was a planet when I was born, and it will be a planet forever, as far as I'm concerned. Toronto built some underground walkways for people to move about the city without having to worry about traffic or weather. It's called the Path, Path, a walkway that is now filled with shops, restaurants, and social areas. Many businesses are connected to this underground as well. Hopefully, the Memengwesi won't decide that this would be a neat place to go hunting. All along these public tunnels are doors leading into private spaces. How many miles of private tunnels might there be down under the city? Nobody knows. There are many miles of tunnels not intended for people. Sewer lines, cable, electricity, monsters all need a place to be, and so they built tunnels all over the city and ran all the utilities through them. With time, a lot of these tunnel maps got lost. There are tunnels that could go just about anywhere. As new tunnels are being built, on occasion the workers have found old tunnels that they didn't even know were there. I'm sure that the sound of tunneling can be heard by the creatures, allowing them to move to other parts of the city. Someday, they just might decide they're not moving. They're going to stand and fight. Oh, that's going to be interesting. I'm sure the city of Toronto will let us know when this happens and how it turns out. There are many other non public secret tunnels under Toronto, only some of which have been discovered. For example, Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital once used a system of tunnels where staff members could navigate the hospital with ease. There's a secret tunnel under Roy Thompson Hall, which was discovered in the 80s. It mysteriously held a locked safe whose contents have never been publicly revealed. Folks believe some of these tunnels might lead to secret government facilities that are also being used by aliens. There are stories about a giant secret underground city which is underneath Lake Ontario. People have seen lights flying over the lake that some seem to vanish into the water. That video released by the Pentagon showing a craft that flew into the water without slowing down comes to mind. South America, Puerto Rico, and parts of the United States, we have creatures who roam the countryside. We call them chupacabras. They are blood drinking monsters that typically go after livestock, such as cattle, chickens, goats, and family pets. Once again, I want my cats up and walking about. Chupacabras are about 3 feet in length, typically have bright red eyes, just like the tunnel monster. Although they're usually known to be hairless, They have leathery skin, and in some of the stories, they have scales, small wings, and little tufts of fur. They're also described as having spikes that stick up along their back and go all the way down to their tail. It has been said that the creature underneath Toronto might just be a relative of the chupacabras, uh, hairy chupacabras. Most folks have been told that the chupacabras was first seen in 1995 in Puerto Rico. I work with a lot of guys from Puerto Rico, and that's not how they pronounce it. I'm not from Puerto Rico, so that's how I pronounce it. Sorry, guys, I'm not going to even try the correct pronunciation. Blood sucking monsters have been around for many years. There were reports of killer kangaroos from back in the 30s. The basic description of the chupacabra has usually been a hairless kangaroo with wings and spikes down its back. The creature might have been around for years before anybody gave it a name. At that time, like I said, it was simply called the killer kangaroo. May 1963, there were several people who reported sightings of a strange, hairy wild man near Centerville on the outskirts of St. Louis, Illinois. The sightings started on around May 9th, with one or two people seeing this weird creature. As the days went by, more folks reported seeing this wild man. The police said they were getting about 50 calls a night from people who had seen this man beast. Some saw him or it while driving along the streets of the roadways. Others said that it was in their yards. One man called in to report that the monster had tried to attack him. Anytime the police arrived, the creature was nowhere to be seen. This is probably due to how the police would respond. Lights and sirens and screaming into the area and searchlights waving back and forth. As many people saw the creature and were willing to report it, a few said they saw a man beast climbing down into the storm drain. The creature was able to get its fingers under the edge of the grate, pull the heavy metal covering away. It clomb down into the sewer and then pulled the grate back into place. These are not the actions of an ape or a bear. I knew how to open a man. It knows how to open a manhole, and then it knows how to close it as well. A group of kids in St. Louis spotted the man beast creeping along the street. They first saw it on Ninth Street at the 12th Street intersection. The kids began to follow it at a good distance. By peeking around the corners and staying back in the shadows, the kids got a good look at this thing. Now, they said it looked like it was a half man, half woman. One side of its head was bald and had a stubble on its chin. The arm and the chest were quite muscular looking. The other side of the head had long hair and the facial features were quite feminine. The arm was a lot thinner and it had one lady part on its chest. Hey, that's what they said. After most of a month of sightings, they began to taper off. The phones at the local police and sheriff's offices went from dozens to one or two a night, and then they stopped altogether. As more important things came up, the story vanished into the archives as being just a bunch of people thinking that they saw something. If by chance you find yourself in a similar situation where you see something unexplainable, but you just don't want to tell people about it, here's what you ought to do: write it down. Write it on a piece of paper or put it on a file in your computer somewhere where you can find it in 10 or 15 years. You might just change your mind by then and want to talk about what you've seen. Having the details written out will help you remember more than if you just try to go by your memory. My memory is so good, I can remember things that never happened. You know you're going to lose your notes long before you want them. It's a better idea to write out the details and send them to me. I will give you a different name so only you and I know who the story is about. If you decide after reading my draft you still don't want it printed, let me know and I'll just keep it away in a file somewhere until either you change your name or you stop breathing. Just a thought. I've talked to so many people in the past while interviewing folks for my books where they will tell me that they have written down copious amounts of notes on their sighting, but now they can't find them. So just be on the safe side. Send them to me. I'll try not to lose them, and I promise I won't print them until you say so. Tokyo, Japan is well aware of monsters. Godzilla, Mothra, Barugan, Daimajin, just to name a few. Oh, yes, I've watched a lot of those old Japanese monster movies. Utility workers under the city streets in 1970 were walking through a tunnel when one of the workers got his foot stuck in something that looked like a bunch of spider webs. Huge spider webs. The workers began looking around, trying to figure out what could have formed this mass of stringy fibers. In their flashlights, they saw a huge spider web. Scattered about in the web were the husks of long dead animals: rats, snakes, rabbits, squirrels, small animals, but still huge to be taken by any spider. The web was stretched across a side tunnel that was filling it from wall to wall. In the center was an opening that was shaped like a funnel. Now, this sounds like a funnel spider had built its web in the opening, but it's not that big. Funnel spiders only get to be about 2 inches across. That's from toe tip to toe tip. Their webs are usually 12 to 15 inches across. Just the funnel itself of this massive spider web was 10 inches across. The spider that made it must have been huge. Now think about a spider that is as wide across as your shoe is long. The workers all found a good reason to get out of there and go work someplace else. Later that week, the web was gone and there was no sign of any giant spiders anywhere. Along with reports of giant spiders, workers under Tokyo have seen rats as big as medium sized dogs. Think about a 15 to 20-pound rat. There doesn't seem to be any kind of industry that could be causing giant underground creatures to appear. However, Tokyo is a major transportation hub. Maybe something that was being shipped through town leaked out, and that's what causes these giant creatures to be created. Carthage, Missouri has a huge underground storage facility that is known as the Underground. Come on, can't somebody come up with a better name than that? The Carthage Underground is a collection of marble quarries, most of which are owned by Americold. This company alone has 43 million square feet of underground storage space. There are warehouses and factories primarily for food processing and storage. There are other companies as well. Anything you can think of that needs to be stored in a safe, temperature controlled place can be found in the underground. The total area of the underground is difficult to trace. Some say it can stretch as far as Joplin, Missouri, which is 20 miles away. Urban explorers like to visit the site due to the decrepit abandoned quarries that are mixed in with the working underground factories and warehouses. Nobody knows how many entrances there might be or which tunnels might lead to others. March 2004, a couple of folks were riding around the quarries on ATVs when they ran into something out of this world. The witnesses said they had motored into one of the underground warehouses by way of an abandoned quarry entrance. Looking around, they got the impression the warehouse was being used by the Navy. There were boxes and containers all marked with government symbols. There were also boxes with civil defense markings. The tunnel was to be used as a fallout shelter, either currently or for some time in the past. The high school I went to had a basement that was a fallout shelter, and it was packed full of civil defense stuff. Well, over the years, being a bunch of students, a lot of that stuff disappeared. I didn't take it. Honest, I swear. I don't want the government come knocking at my door wanting to know what happened to all that civil defense food that, well, it wasn't me, it was someone else. The walls of the tunnel were smooth and the floor was well paved. There were overhead lights ever so often to let them see ahead. As they motored along, they noticed one section of the tunnel had some weird images painted on it. It looked like somebody had come along before them and had tagged the walls, except they didn't say anything. It was just lines running up, down, back and forth, and squiggly bits, and the symbols were chaotic and unreadable. One of the tunnel walls just past this spot looked a bit peculiar. It looked fake. So one of the explorers stuck his hand through and he found there was room on the other side. It looked like this wall was a hologram of some kind. Thinking they were going to find some cool things, they just barged ahead. I wonder if alcohol was involved or just teenage courage. The opening led to a bunch of other tunnels that went in all directions. The air became damp and it smelled like mildew. The overhead lights were a lot farther apart, and the tunnel was quite dim. These two explorers spotted people ahead. There were two men standing in the tunnel. Well, not wanting to be arrested or detained by the military, these two explorers stopped so they could get a better look. These were not men. They were giant reptiles. One looked to be red and stood about 7 feet tall. The other one was more whitish and about 6 feet tall. The two creatures either heard the sound of the ATVs or they could smell the exhaust. Whichever it was, the two kids were discovered. One of the creatures, and it just happened to be the bigger of the two, began to chase them. The two kids turned their ATVs and fled as fast as they could back the way they'd come. The creature chasing them had some kind of a handheld weapon, and it was trying to aim it at them as it ran. The two kids were bobbing and weaving, trying to outdistance this monster. One of the ATVs was hit by some kind of an energy blast from behind, and it killed the engine. The two riders figured it was caused by the creature that was shooting at them. The rider of the disabled vehicle jumped on the back of the one still running, and they took off once more. The guy on the back was able to look back without crashing, so he did. The red reptilian had stopped chasing them. It was standing between the two walls where the graffiti had been painted. For unknown reasons, this reptilian would not go beyond the symbols on the tunnel wall. The two explorers, now on one ATV, both looked at the creature looking back at them. The whole situation was just too much, so they gunned it and fled for the exit. As they went, the driver became afraid that the reptilian might have called ahead to have a welcoming party at the exit. As soon as he saw the side tunnel they had used to get into this semi secured military storage facility, he turned and headed to the outside. As fresh air and sunshine welcomed them, the two now had to decide should they call someone and report this or just keep their mouths shut. The call was made and the local sheriff's department answered. It was greeted with what you would expect. The deputy figured these two kids were drunk, crazy, on drugs, or all of the above, or maybe they were just lying. Think of Chunk calling the sheriff's department on Goonies. Something to think about. You know, Goonies was American Treasure on a lower budget. Soon after escaping from the tunnel, a security detail converged on them. These were not deputies, but some private company. The two were questioned and then threatened and told to get out of there and to never come back, under threat of being arrested and prosecuted by the Navy for trespassing and other violations that they were going to invent. If you've ever seen the videos of people who accidentally stray onto Area 51 grounds, the chocolate chip dudes, aka Whackin' Hut security, read the trespassers the riot act, followed by threats and guarantees of civil court lawsuits and time in jail, all for crossing a line in the dirt. This was how the two kids on 1A TV were handled. A woman and her husband were driving in South Dallas. It was late at night and few people were out. They mostly had the streets to themselves. They passed under an overpass en route to their home. They were both wide awake and looking ahead. Nothing to distract them. A werewolf came darting out of a side street, ran right in front of their vehicle. It was moving so fast that it only took 4 steps to cross a 4-lane street. That's about 40 feet. The couple couldn't see the face very well. It was moving too fast. They did see the body, which looked just like something out of a horror movie. It was on 2 legs, running like a man, on the pads of its feet. The creature looked to be about 7 feet tall, muscular, and covered in dark hair. The woman said that she could see eyeshine even though the thing never looked their way. It wasn't the reflection of their headlights, but more like the eyes themselves were glowing. It disappeared into an open field. They both looked in that direction, but the thing was gone. Neither of them could speak. They were both so startled. To see a werewolf in a rural or countryside, that could be weird. But to see one in a huge city is really bizarre. It's unheard of. Well, you did just hear it. A young man was working for a security company back in 2012. Their duties allowed them to carry sidearms, and his was a Smith & Wesson semi-auto. One of their duties one of their duty locations was the Broadmoor Seven Falls in the Cheyenne Mountain Canyon, near Colorado Springs, Colorado. Since I have so many listeners outside the United States, I guess I'd better give better locations. Normally, I would have just called it Colorado Springs. A lot of y'all won't know where that is. Well, a lot of y'all in the United States probably don't know where that is either. Been there once in the Army, had to land there and not much to see, but we were stuck on the military base the whole time we were there. Anyway, getting back to the story. The park was set into the canyon with the parking lot down at the bottom near the highway. And some of the attractions were up on the top of a small mountain. The security officers were expected to walk up and down on a regular basis to keep an eye on everything. It wasn't unheard of for them to walk 7 or 8 miles in a shift. Talk about not needing to go to the gym, getting that cardio workout. During peak season, some shifts might run from 4 p.m. till 3 a.m., depending on if it was a weekend or a holiday. In the summer months, it would get hot, and there was nowhere to get in out of the sun. The falls were considered the one of the main attractions. I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the main attractions was a local Indian dance. Ute and Cheyenne tribes would come to the park to show off their dancing abilities. The falls were considered sacred for hundreds of years, and the dancers were more performing for themselves than for the watchers. The security guards had to move around through the crowd to watch for any illegal activity. As things were winding down, the officers would clear the park to be sure nobody stayed behind for whatever activity troublemakers might think of. Once the place was mostly empty, the witness said he would hear sounds of movement when there was nobody around. He would hear footsteps in the dark, but when he went to investigate, nobody there. He felt on many occasions as if something was watching him. It gave him a very uncomfortable feeling, like he was about to be attacked. Even with his pistol, he felt exposed and vulnerable. Sometimes he would hear growling coming from the dark. He saw eyeshine on many occasions, but on closer examination, there would be nothing there. The security officers also monitored the exit to be sure that traffic flowed smoothly. The witness was monitoring the exit gate, watching cars and pickups drive out. Not a real fascinating activity. His eyes wandered about, looking at the trees along the edge of the drive. Movement caught his attention. A shape was moving up in the treetops, but it was hard to focus on. The witness said it kind of reminded him of the alien from the movie Predator when it was using its cloaking device. Cam Hale and Kyle Filson refer to these creatures as glimmermen. You see the outline of a human like shape, but the body itself is kind of pixelated and it matches the background. It makes it hard to say what you're actually looking at. The Glimmerman jumped from one tree to another, breaking off a huge branch that landed on the ground with a loud crash. The thing then leaped to the ground and began crawling towards him. Now, it may have been shock or disbelief, but he stood by the exit gate and watched as this thing crawled across the parking lot, heading his way. Once it was way too close, the Glimmerman stood up. It looked to be about 7 feet tall, and it was still only the outline of a humanoid. The only features he could see were the eyes that were glowing like red hot coals. It stretched out its arms, stood there for a bit, then it turned and moved back to the trees. The witness kept his eyes on the creature as it moved away into the thicker branches until he could no longer see it. Thinking this must have been just his imagination, maybe too much sun, maybe he was working too many hours, he decided to keep the sighting to himself. It could be a bad thing to have a reputation as seeing things that weren't there. Years went by, and the witness ran into one of his old coworkers who had retired some time ago. They did what most people do, talked about work. They went back and forth about people they knew and they'd worked with and things they had seen. The older man eventually asked if the witness had ever seen the predator in the park. It turned out that the witness wasn't the only officer to see the Glimmer Man. It was only after retiring that they would be comfortable enough to talk about it. Apparently, a lot of the security guys had seen this thing, but they just didn't want to talk about it. I'm sure there are many out there who have seen or heard stories about creatures that just shouldn't exist. If you'd like to see your story in print, send it to me at strangethings at arcanasa.com. I'll work it into a more readable format, and then I'll send you the draft. You can read the draft, and if you like the way it sounds, you give me the go ahead. I'll put it in my next book. If you don't like the way I wrote it, or all of a sudden you discover you're uncomfortable talking about it or seeing it in print, I'll store it away. You'll never see it on a page of a book until you say so, or like I said, you stop breathing. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, tell your neighbors what they're missing. Send it to people. I'm on YouTube. You just hit that little share button and fire it off. Let other people see what they're missing. If you'd like to listen to the stories of Pam Bogus and the Bag Company, she works for the Bogus Anomalous Group. It's a humorous fictional story that I started to write many years ago, and well, I'm still writing others. You can catch it here on any of the uh, the podcast websites. You can find it on YouTube. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not on a lot of the pod sites. It's on iHeartRadio and on YouTube. You can also find it on Storytime with Chris James, which is my other channel. Until next time, this is Chris James for Strange Things, and you'll just have to hum the music to yourself because, well, there isn't going to be any. Till next time.